My name is Alina Torres. I'm 28, born and raised in Laredo, Texas, just a few miles from the border, in a neighborhood where houses were patched up with hope and silence. I've always had what people call a quiet presence. Soft voice, soft movements, soft ambition. But it's my face that people notice first, and not for reasons that ever helped me. My skin is darker than anyone else in David's family, my nose just a little wider, my hair thick, coiled, and unwilling to flatten into the silky shape his mother seemed to require from women near her son. I don't wear heavy makeup or high heels, not because I protest them, but because they make me feel like I'm dressing up in someone else's story. I've never belonged in glossy photos, and I've never had the desire to be the center of attention. Until that night, when I became the center of something much worse. The hall was drowning in crystal and white roses, a wedding planned to precision. Not by me. I would have chosen simple chairs and my abuela's old garden if they had let me. But this was David's family's world, and I had agreed, naively, that it was easier to let them control the day than fight over napkin textures and wine lists. I stood by the head table like a guest at my own life, dressed in a satin gown that fit too tightly around the ribs and left my arms bare, open to scrutiny. The air conditioning barely touched the sweat at my spine. They had seated my family near the kitchen doors. I didn't notice at first. My mother was too proud to complain, and my brother kept distracting her with his nervous jokes. Still, I caught her glancing toward the table nearest to us, where David's aunt was laughing, tossing her hand like a silk scarf over her champagne glass. I watched my mother's eyes darken slightly and looked away before the pain could anchor. In me. This wasn't the moment for old wounds. I had imagined that I'd get through the night pretending, that I'd smile, dance a little, say thank you to the people I'd never see again, and hold David's hand tightly enough to make everything else disappear. But then she stood up. David's mother, Lorraine. Her voice had been floating around the room all night like perfume. She had kissed every cheek, commented on every dress, approved every lighting angle. Her hair didn't move when she walked. It shimmered like a lie. She tapped her glass with a spoon, and the sound was so sharp and deliberate that even the servers paused. The crowd turned. I turned. David looked up at her with the loyalty of a son, still hoping she'd one day just love. And then she began to speak. It started slow, wrapped in sugar. A thank you to guests, to organizers, to decorators. The usual list of false praise. I tried not to roll my eyes. But then she said my name. She said it like it didn't belong in her mouth. Elongated it slightly, like it was foreign, like it had weight she didn't want to carry. And then came the pause. Just long enough to make everyone shift in their chairs. I suppose, she said, some things in life surprise us. The tone was soft. The implication wasn't. She began to talk about legacy, about tradition, about how their family had always valued elegance, restraint, a certain dignity. She made it clear she wasn't reading from a note. This was coming straight from her chest, or her stomach, wherever resentment digests over time. She looked at me, but not directly. Just enough to make it clear I was being dissected. I felt my spine lengthen. A reflex, maybe. My grandmother used to tell me, when you are most ashamed, lift your chin the highest. I could feel the eyes turning toward me, some confused, some expectant, some already judging. She didn't scream. Not then. She didn't need to. Every word was surgical. She recalled David's ex-girlfriend, described her like a memory no one wanted to forget. Harvard law, ballet, blonde, a family deeply rooted in old American soil. She mentioned the word match more than once. Like relationships were puzzles and I was the piece from another box. I could feel the blood pooling behind my ears, heat crawling up my neck. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, my fingers interlocked so tightly I wouldn't be surprised if I left half-moons in my palms. The guests began to shift. Some looked down, pretending to reread the menu. Others looked at David, like he had invited a mess into their polished celebration. And still others watched me. Not with pity. With curiosity. Waiting to see if I'd break. Lorraine wasn't finished. She said, "We don't choose who our children love, do we?" And smiled like a knife. Then she said the word. But for some, families' love comes with compromise. And today, we make that compromise. There was no confusion anymore. She was calling me a compromise. And then she said it. This. She gestured toward me with her glass raised high, as if to toast. This is our shame. I heard someone inhale sharply. My mother's chair scraped against the floor. I didn't cry. Not then. I just felt myself evaporate inside. Not because I was ashamed of who I was, but because she had taken the moment I had tried so hard to believe in and stained it with something I couldn't scrub out. David stood up beside me, his hand searching for mine. But his voice didn't come. He looked at her, and then back at me. I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he believed this was just Lorraine being Lorraine. Maybe he thought I could handle it, and maybe I could have. But then someone else stood up, David's father. Quiet. Always quiet. He barely spoke during the engagement, rarely looked at me. But now he stood, napkin folded in his hand like he needed something to hold on to. The room stilled. Even Lorraine turned. And just like that, I knew something was about to shift. Not for the better. Not yet. But something had cracked open, and no one in that room would be able to pretend otherwise. I kept my eyes down, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing what was behind them. I knew if I looked up, I'd see smirks pretending to be polite smiles, see eyes darting toward their companions, silently asking if this was really happening, if this was the woman their precious David had chosen. The room wasn't hot, but my skin burned. I could feel the flush across my chest, creeping up my neck, the kind that no foundation could hide, the kind born not of embarrassment, but of rage pressed tightly into silence. My hands were still clenched, fingertips digging into the soft flesh of my palms, grounding me. Every second that passed felt like a minute stretched too thin. The sound of forks clinking on porcelain had stopped. Even the background music, which had been a soft, elegant piano piece, seemed like a distant memory now. Time had folded in on itself, and all that existed was me, her, and the unspoken agreement between everyone in that room that I didn't belong there. Not in that dress, not at that table, not beside that man. My dress was a deep taupe. Lorraine had hated it the moment she saw it. Said it washed me out. Said it was too plain for a bride marrying into their family. She offered to buy me another. Something more fitted, more beaded, more visible. But I'd chosen this one on purpose. It reminded me of my mother's wedding dress. Simple, modest, beautiful in a way only those who understood quiet elegance would see. Now, as I stood there, I realized the dress had become another reason to mock me, a visual confirmation of the class divide Lorraine had no intention of hiding. My shoulders itched from being exposed. I wished I had chosen something, with sleeves, something that could have shielded me, created a barrier between their eyes and my skin. I was aware of how my arms looked in the bright lights, strong, a little fuller than fashion demanded, untoned in a way that suggested work, not vanity. Lorraine's words had found their target, but it was the silence that followed that truly tore at me. The kind of silence that didn't come from shock but from consent. Nobody stood up for me. Nobody protested. not even David. He hadn't expected it, I could tell. His expression was a mix of confusion and discomfort, like someone waking up in the middle of a nightmare, unsure if it's real. But he didn't say anything. He just stood there, blinking, his hand still hovering near mine, as if waiting for a cue that never came. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't let myself accept before. David loved me, but he would never protect me from his mother. The guests began to murmur again. Whispers floated like smoke, thick and sticky. I could hear fragments. Did she really say that? I heard she's from the border. No college degree, I think. She works at a school, right? Just a teacher's aide, not even a teacher. Their words weren't cruel in tone, but they didn't have to be. Pity disguised as curiosity is still pity, and pity is the first cousin of judgment. My mother, still seated near the kitchen, had turned pale. Her eyes met mine for a split second, and I saw her shake her head. Barely perceptible, but I caught it. A silent plea. Not to leave. Not to cry. Not to do anything that would give them more ammunition. My mother had lived her whole life knowing how to survive in rooms where she wasn't welcome. Now it was my turn. A server walked past me, eyes lowered, avoiding mine. Even she looked embarrassed for me. I thought about running, not out of the hall, but back through time. I wanted to go back to when David had first introduced me to his parents, to that awful brunch where Lorraine had smiled with her teeth, but not her eyes. I had told myself I was imagining her condescension, that I was projecting my insecurities. I had wanted so badly to be wrong. But I wasn't wrong. I had never been wrong. I just didn't want to believe that someone could hate, so quietly, so elegantly, that it could be mistaken for civility. There was a part of me that wanted to scream, to flip the table, to tear the veil from the carefully curated decor and expose the rot underneath. But I didn't. I stood still, like I had practiced my whole life. The quiet girl, the modest girl, the girl who never caused trouble, the girl who should feel lucky someone like David had chosen her. The lace at the edge of my dress scratched against my thigh, a minor irritation that suddenly felt unbearable. I shifted slightly, just enough to remind myself that I could still move. That I wasn't paralyzed by this humiliation. My chest rose and fell, slowly, deliberately, like I was controlling each breath, anchoring myself to the floor with oxygen alone. Lorraine had returned to her seat now, smug in her performance. She had thrown the match, and the fire was catching. People were still watching me, waiting to see what I would do. I could feel their need for a reaction, for a spectacle. They wanted the poor girl from the poor family to prove the point, to cry, to scream, to flee. But I would not give them that. Not because I was strong, not because I was noble, but because I knew something they didn't. This wasn't over. David finally spoke, barely audible, just a tremble of a word. But I didn't hear it. My mind was too loud. Not chaotic, focused. My mind was pulling apart the moment, searching for the threads, finding the pattern in the cruelty. This wasn't just a public humiliation. This was a punishment. A lesson. Lorraine wanted to remind everyone in that room, especially me, that no matter what ring I wore, no matter what name I took, I would never be one of them. But what she didn't understand, what none of them did, was that I had never wanted to be one of them. I hadn't spent my life yearning for ivory-covered invitations or champagne towers. I hadn't grown up dreaming of chandeliers and calligraphy place cards. I had dreamed of peace, of love that didn't require disguise, of walking into a room without needing to shrink. As I stood there, I realized something was shifting inside me, not breaking, hardening, calming, like a lake freezing over. I had been made small, but I would not disappear. Lorraine had thrown her stones, but they wouldn't sink me. They would only rest at the bottom of the water. I would learn to still again. The chatter was rising now. People slowly returning to their meals, to their comfort, to their version of the story where nothing truly bad had happened. I was being written out of the narrative already, reduced to a single dramatic moment, soon to be replaced by cake and dance and drunken laughter. But I wasn't gone. I was still here. And so was David's father, still seated, still silent. I hadn't looked at him until now, but I could feel something about to happen, something no one else was expecting, something heavy and old and buried. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. But he was getting ready, and I was finally ready too. It wasn't the words themselves that haunted me as I stood there. It was the ease with which she said them, the confidence, as if she had been rehearsing that performance for months, years maybe. Like the idea of me had been gnawing at her long before she ever had to see my face at her son's side. There was something ancient in her disdain, something rehearsed not just by her, but by all the women in her lineage who had learned how to wound without raising their voices. It was in her posture, the careful way she folded her napkin after, delivering the final blow, the way her eyes swept across the room like she was gauging the damage she had inflicted and finding it sufficient. It was a ritual for her, and I had been the sacrifice. They called it tradition, this obsession with image, legacy, and bloodlines. But I was starting to see it for what it truly was. A curse. Not cast in spells or old books, but in habits, in expectations, in the tight smiles passed from mother to daughter like a family heirloom. Lorraine wasn't the first to look at someone like me and see a threat, and she wouldn't be the last, but there was something about her that made it worse. How good she was at pretending it was about anything other than what it really was. I thought about the house where David grew up. The perfectly trimmed hedges, the white shutters that never had a speck of dust, the hallway lined with sepia-tone portraits of stiff-lipped ancestors staring out like silent jurors. Even then, I had felt watched, judged, as if walking on that marble floor in shoes that weren't designer made my footsteps louder than anyone else's. Lorraine's world was curated, preserved, and tightly controlled. And into that world, I had walked wearing shoes from a local thrift store and hope stitched into every seam of my dress. The thing is, I wasn't ashamed of where I came from. Not really. But I had spent most of my life learning to make myself smaller in rooms where my presence felt like an intrusion. I had perfected the art of the polite smile, the downturned gaze, the soft answer. Not because I didn't have things to say, but because I knew no one really wanted to hear them. They wanted the illusion of inclusion, the optics of acceptance. I was never meant to be real to them. I was meant to be a story David told about how he had found love in an unexpected place, a narrative he could control. Until now. And as I looked around that room full of white flowers and muted linens, I realized they didn't even see me. They saw an interruption, a deviation from the path Lorraine had so meticulously carved for her son. I was the dirt on her, polished floor, the crack in her fine china. And now that I had dared to stand at the front of her cathedral, she was determined to cleanse me from it. She hadn't just humiliated me for being poor, or plain, or too quiet. She had humiliated me for existing outside of her version of what a woman should be, for daring to stand tall despite not being born into satin and secrecy, for not apologizing every time my skin darkened in the summer, or my hair frizzed with the humidity, for being the woman David loved, even though she had never planned for that kind of woman to enter her family. The worst part was that some people in that room were nodding along. Not openly, not in a way they'd ever admit out loud. But their silence was complicit. Their lowered gazes were agreements sealed in cowardice. And still, I stood. I thought about my grandmother then, about the stories she used to tell me when I was little. Stories of women who had to survive by pretending, who folded themselves into acceptable shapes just to be allowed to stay. She used to brush my hair and whisper, "You're stronger than you know, Alina, but strength sometimes looks like stillness." I hadn't understood that then. I think I do now. Lorraine believed she was protecting something, preserving a legacy. But that legacy was a mask, and it was slipping. Her voice had been too sharp, her words too cruel, her toast too long, and the cracks were beginning to show. The father, still seated in silence, hadn't moved. But I had caught a flicker in his eye, something that looked too much like shame to be anything else. The guests returned to their conversations, but the energy had shifted. There was a tension under the laughter now, a crackle beneath the clinking of glasses. People were avoiding my gaze altogether, or glancing at me in quick, embarrassed flashes, and I knew they were asking themselves what I would do. Would I run? Would I cry? Would I call off the wedding? But what they didn't understand was that this wasn't about the wedding anymore. This wasn't about the dress or the seating chart, or the floral arrangements. This was about being seen, truly seen. Not as a project, not as a mistake, not as a compromise, but as a woman who had walked through life with her head bowed too many times and had finally decided to raise it. I shifted my gaze and let it fall on Lorraine again. She was laughing, with a cousin now, her face animated, her mask reattached. But there was something brittle at the edges, something too practiced, and I realized then that her cruelty wasn't power. It was fear. Fear of anything that didn't fit. Fear of the unfamiliar. Fear that one woman's presence might unravel the entire illusion she had built. David was still standing beside me, his hand now lightly on the small of my back, a gesture that felt more performative than comforting. He didn't look at me, didn't speak. I wondered what was running through his mind, if he was regretting all of this, or if he was just frozen, waiting for the storm to pass. Either way, I couldn't rely on him anymore. Whatever I did next, it had to be for me. Lorraine's words had poisoned the air, but they had also lit something inside me. Not anger exactly, not revenge, but clarity. I didn't want to belong to a family that measured worth in pedigree and appearance. I didn't want to be part of a tradition that required me to erase who I was to fit in. And if that meant I would always be the outsider, so be it. Better to stand alone in truth than be embraced under false terms. But something was still coming. I could feel it. David's father hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. But he was watching. Not just me. Her. Watching her with a look I hadn't seen before. Something was building behind his eyes. And it wasn't pride. It wasn't indifference. It was something older. Something tired, like a man who had watched this charade for too long and finally realized the stage was collapsing beneath them all. I took a deep breath and let it fill me. The room hadn't shrunk. I had. But I was done doing that. The curse Lorraine thought. She was protecting her family from. It wasn't me. It was already in the blood. Already in the silence. Already in the way no one had ever told her no. And someone was about to. I could feel it. The shift. The moment before the reckoning. And when it came, I wouldn't look away. I noticed him from the corner of my eye, seated 2 tables away near the window where the light had begun to fade, casting long, uneven shadows across the white linen cloth. He wasn't laughing like the others. He hadn't picked up his fork in a while. He sat still, one hand wrapped around a glass he hadn't sipped from, the other resting flat on the table like he was bracing himself against something he couldn't quite name. His eyes hadn't left Lorraine since she sat down, and though his expression was unreadable to most, something in my gut twisted when I looked at him. There was something about his stillness that felt louder than all the clinking glasses and murmuring voices in that room. I didn't know who he was then. I just knew he wasn't like the rest of them. People like Lorraine were so good at centering themselves in every space, controlling the tempo of a room with a glance or a pointed smile, but this man wasn't under her spell. He looked at her like he'd seen behind the curtain once and never forgotten what he'd found. And now, as the room slowly returned to its curated elegance, as the wound she had opened in front of everyone was politely ignored, he stayed rooted in his seat, watching, not in judgment, not even in sympathy. Something colder, something closer to understanding. I turned my attention away from him, not wanting to linger too long. I had learned to recognize people who saw too much. They were dangerous in their own way. They had the power to pull at threads others ignored, and I couldn't afford to unravel now. But even as I tried to focus on the silverware, on the way David's hand now rested more deliberately on my back as if he sensed that I was slipping away from him, I felt that man's presence like a weight just beyond my shoulder. The night dragged forward in fractured time. Speeches resumed, awkward and dry. The cousin who followed Lorraine at the microphone tried to bring levity, made a joke about the passion of strong mothers that earned a few reluctant chuckles. No one mentioned me. No one dared to. It was as if I had become a void in the room, too full of discomfort to acknowledge, too real to address. Even David seemed unsure how to act now, his movements rehearsed but slower, like he was afraid to touch me too directly. I wondered if he feared I might turn to ash in his hands. Kept my posture rigid, my smile faint, my eyes slightly lowered, not out of submission, but control. There was power in that stillness, a warning, the kind my grandmother used to say animals gave each other in the wild. Be careful. I'm not running. That doesn't mean I'm not dangerous. But the tension, building inside me, had nowhere to go. It was spreading, pressing against my chest, rising in my throat. The room felt smaller with every passing second, the air heavier. I needed space, air. I needed to know that I wasn't the only one who saw what had just happened, who felt the sharpness of Lorraine's words, the poison of her precision. So when I saw the man near the window stand up and slip quietly out the side door, I followed. I didn't do it consciously at first. It was instinct. I stood, murmured something meaningless to David, who nodded without meeting my eyes, and stepped away from the table as if going to fix my dress or find a restroom. But I wasn't going anywhere people expected me to go. My legs moved faster, the farther I got from the chandelier light. I passed a row of waiters lined up by the kitchen, one of them glancing at me like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. The hallway beyond the main hall was colder, darker, the music, a distant thrum. The outside door had been left slightly ajar. I stepped out and breathed for the first time in what felt like hours. The night air hit me like water, cool and sobering. The man was leaning against a column just beyond the patio, the shadows barely, touching his features. He didn't look at me as I approached. He had been waiting. There was something about him. Something in the way he stood with his weight tilted slightly forward, like his body carried stories his mouth hadn't yet shared. His suit was worn but well kept, a style that hadn't been new in a decade. His hands were calloused, too rough for the soft, curated world inside that building. This man didn't belong at that wedding any more than I did. And that, perhaps more than anything, made me trust him. I stopped a few feet away, unsure what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe just confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that someone else had seen it all and understood it for what it was. But he didn't speak right away. He just stared out into the darkness beyond the property line, toward the trees that bordered the estate like silent sentinels. When he finally did speak, his voice was low and even, measured, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who rarely wasted words and never used them for decoration. And what he said changed everything. He hadn't been invited by Lorraine. He wasn't family. He had worked for them, once, long ago. Landscaping, repair, maintenance. Years ago, before David had gone off to college, before Lorraine's husband, had made his money the way all men like him eventually do, quietly, aggressively, and with no one asking too many questions. This man had seen things, heard things that didn't match the perfect picture inside that ballroom. He had come, tonight, because someone else had invited him, someone who hadn't expected things to unfold like this, someone who had grown tired of watching from the sidelines. He didn't say who. He didn't need to. I could feel it. And then, slowly, he began to tell me what he had seen all those years ago. Not gossip, not speculation, facts, memories, events. He spoke of Lorraine not as a villain, but as a woman so consumed by her fear of exposure that she built a fortress of performance around her. A woman who had made deals in shadows, who had rewritten her own story so many times that even she no longer recognized the original draft. He remembered the first time he saw her break. Not in tears, but in fury. He remembered the name she whispered when she thought no one could hear. A name I didn't recognize. A mistake. A secret. He hadn't told anyone. Not then. Not for years. Until now. Because tonight, something had shifted. Lorraine had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Not with what she said, but with how easily she said it. And he knew. He knew. It was time someone else spoke. As he spoke, the fog in my mind began to lift. The image of Lorraine as untouchable, unshakable, began to blur at the edges. She wasn't invincible. She was just practiced, just loud enough, confident enough, to make everyone else doubt their instincts. But not this man, and not me, not anymore. By the time he finished, the night had deepened. The noise inside the ballroom continued, muffled behind thick walls and expensive glass. But out here, the air was clear. The truth hung between us like breath. He looked at me, really looked, and in his gaze I saw something I hadn't seen in anyone else all night. Certainty. He believed me. He believed in what I had endured, and he believed Lorraine's story was not the only one worth telling. I walked back inside slowly, my spine straighter, the warmth of truth steadying my steps. Because now I wasn't alone. Now I had more than just silence to stand on. Now, someone else had seen everything, and soon everyone else would too. When I stepped back into the hall, the warmth I had found outside seemed to evaporate immediately. The air was heavier now, thicker somehow, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension and were exhaling it back at me with every breath. The lighting, too, felt more artificial than before, brighter in a way that flattened everything, stripping away softness and mercy. The music had picked up again, polite and forgettable, a slow jazz piece that floated over the tables like a blanket no one asked for. People had resumed eating, drinking, pretending. That was the talent of this world, its ability to pretend faster than reality could settle. A performance resumed after an inconvenient intermission. I passed between the tables slowly, invisible, in plain sight. Eyes flicked toward me, quickly enough to register that I was back, but not long enough to be held accountable for what they might be thinking. It was safer that way. For them. For me. No one wanted confrontation. Not anymore. They wanted a return to normal, the sealing of cracks before anything bled out. And so I gave them what they wanted. I walked with composure, with silence, as though I had not just heard the first real truth of the night outside, beneath the cold stars. David was still at our table, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, his posture suggesting a man who had once believed in firm ground only to discover the earth beneath him was capable of betrayal. He looked up at me like he wasn't sure if I had gone to cry or run. I didn't offer him an explanation. I simply took my seat, placing my hands flat on the table, mirroring the man who had just given me more strength in 10 minutes than David had in our entire engagement. Lorraine was smiling again, of course. That same polished grin, the one she reserved for occasions that demanded presence without intimacy. She was turned toward an older couple now, recounting some story from David's childhood, embellishing the details just enough to keep herself at the center of it. If she noticed my return, she didn't show it, but I felt her awareness like a pulse. She was waiting for me to flinch again, waiting to confirm that she had won. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the rules of the game had just changed. I caught the moment in fragments, not in full, It wasn't grand. There was no dramatic crash of silverware or spotlight turning toward him. There was only the quiet sound of a chair being pushed back and the faint shuffle of shoes across tile. But it was enough. It cut through the ambient, noise like a blade, a sound so ordinary it became unnatural in the context of that room. I turned my head slowly, as did others, drawn by the break in rhythm. David's father was standing. He had always seemed like a man made of silence. At dinners, he let Lorraine speak for both of them. During the planning stages, his input had been minimal, if offered at all. He watched more than he participated, a man who had long ago learned that staying quiet meant survival. But something about him was different now. His posture wasn't slouched or passive. It was deliberate, straight-backed, centered, as if he had finally decided to bear the weight of his own voice. People noticed. The conversation faltered at nearby tables. Forks hovered mid-air. Even Lorraine paused, her smile freezing ever so slightly, her mouth half open on the cusp of another anecdote. She turned to him slowly, eyebrows raised, her expression a blend of surprise and performative curiosity. But her eyes were narrowing. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone at first. He stood still, a man at the edge of a decision, the kind that could not be undone once spoken. And then he turned, not toward Lorraine, not toward David, but toward me. His gaze landed on me and stayed there, not scanning, not assessing, just meeting. I didn't blink. Something passed between us then. Not emotion exactly, but clarity. Like the moment before a storm breaks when the air goes utterly still and everything makes sense for just a second. I could see that he was afraid. Not of Lorraine. Not of what he was about to say. He was afraid because he had waited too long to speak, and now everything depended on the few words he could still claim as his own. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice carried further than I thought it would. It wasn't loud, but it was resonant, filled with a quiet weight that demanded stillness. The kind of voice that didn't beg for attention but made you give it anyway. It was the voice of someone who had spent his life being careful, and now had nothing left to lose. He didn't start with pleasantries. He didn't address the crowd or acknowledge the occasion. He began with the truth. The kind of truth that shatters bone. The kind you can't cover with roses or champagne. He spoke of the past, but not in vague references or safe metaphors. He spoke in names, dates, moments. Lorraine's mask began to slip by the second sentence. Her hand reached for her wine glass, but her grip wasn't steady. Her smile faded, like condensation on cold glass. He told them what he had seen, what he had allowed, what he had buried. He told them about the girl Lorraine had humiliated long before me, how she had driven her away with words that left scars no one could see, how that girl had carried something precious, something Lorraine had feared, a truth too inconvenient, a child, a secret, a shame, and how Lorraine had erased it all, smothered it beneath charity events and curated Christmas cards, made him choose silence over love, and how he had agreed, then, out of fear, out of weakness, out of love for a woman who would never stop being afraid of not being enough. I didn't know the full story. Not yet. But what I did understand, with every fiber of my being, was that this wasn't just about me. Lorraine's hatred of me had never been entirely personal. I was just another mirror held too close. Another reminder that her kingdom had been built on omission. And now, her husband was dismantling it piece by piece. Right here, in front of the guests who had come to celebrate a lie. David was frozen. His hand had slipped away from mine, and his face was pale, the corners of his mouth twitching with the effort to hold on to something. Composure, belief, denial. I didn't look at him for long. My eyes stayed on the man standing, because he was the only one telling the truth now. When he finished, the room didn't erupt. There was no chaos, no shouting, just silence. The kind that follows after something sacred has been broken. The kind that echoes louder than any applause ever could. People didn't move. Some didn't breathe. Lorraine sat motionless, her face unreadable, the way a statue might look before it crumbles. And I sat, spine straight, eyes forward, heart steady, because the reckoning had begun, and I was not afraid anymore. The silence that followed his confession was not hollow. It had mass, like a stone dropped into the center of a frozen lake, splintering every assumption beneath its surface. I could feel it in my chest, in my throat, in the heat that climbed. Behind my eyes, not from shame, not from sadness, but from the weight of finally being seen, not as a disruption, not as a mistake, but as a mirror. One she had tried to avoid for 20 years. One she had buried with the same hands that now trembled beside her untouched wine glass. He hadn't looked at her when he spoke. Not once. It wasn't anger that fueled him. It was regret. It was memory. It was a slow unraveling of everything he had helped hold together in the name of peace. But what peace had there ever been? Silence is not peace. Control is not peace. And I saw it in the way he stood there, finally upright in a life that had kept him small. He had been her accomplice, willing or not. And this was his confession. The story unfolded not as a tale, but as a map. Each point connected with precision. The girl he had met before Lorraine, before the estate, before the polished dinnerware and legacy-bound expectations. Her name was not foreign to him, not the way mine was to Lorraine. She had been someone he loved, someone who didn't come from wealth or recognition but had a laugh that pulled him out of himself and a mind that matched his step for step. He had planned to marry her, had asked, had waited, until the pressure came. It hadn't been Lorraine at first. It had been his own mother, and then his father, and then the rest of them, pressing, insisting, reminding him of the name he carried, of the expectations that came with it. They told him love was a luxury, that foundation required sacrifice, that legacy could not be risked for sentiment. And so he had made the trade. A quiet one. A decision signed not in blood but in distance. He had walked away from the girl, and when she didn't fight him, he took it as permission. As proof that she wasn't meant for the life ahead of him. But she had been pregnant. He learned that months later, too late for apologies, too late for anything. And by then, Lorraine had already entered his life. With her charm and her ambition and her unspoken promise to never ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. She had married him knowing about the past, but only because he told her. Because he needed someone to share the burden, and she had accepted it, with conditions. The child was never to be mentioned, the girl never to be seen again. A stipend was arranged, quietly, regularly. The girl had refused it at first, then, reluctantly, accepted, perhaps not for herself, but for the child. She had moved away. No contact, no visits, just distance. Decades of it. Lorraine had built her life on that silence. She had decorated it, entertained within it, raised her son inside it. David never knew. Or if he did, he had buried it so deep that even now, his face betrayed no recognition. Just shock. I listened, unmoving, breath shallow. Not because I feared what he would say next, but because I knew somehow, long before he reached the final point on the map, where it led. It wasn't a twist. It wasn't revelation. It was recognition. Not the kind you find in documents or photographs. The kind you feel deep in your ribs, like something half-remembered. A rhythm you've walked to your whole life without knowing where it came from. The girl he had loved. The child she raised. A daughter. I sat there, stone still, while the echoes of that truth settled into the walls around me. My skin tingled as though each cell was recalibrating to this new shape of reality. My mother had never spoken of him. She had told me my father was someone who disappeared before I was born, that he wasn't important, that we were enough on our own, and I had believed her. Not because I needed a fairy tale, but because I didn't need anything more than what we had. We survived. We loved. It had been simple, brutal at times, but pure. But now I understood things I hadn't before. The envelopes she used to hide. The moments she'd pause at the mailbox. The long silences when I asked about her past. She hadn't lied to protect him. She had lied to protect me. From this family. From this room. From this woman who sat beside her husband, with a face so tight it looked carved from stone. Lorraine's silence was not grace. It was fury. I could feel it rolling off her in invisible waves, desperate and electric. She had spent her life keeping this secret buried, and now it had clawed its way out at the worst possible moment, through the mouth of the man who had once promised her control. But he wasn't hers anymore. Not in this moment. He belonged to the truth. And to me. He looked at me again then. And though no words passed between us, I saw in his eyes something that neither apology nor denial could replace. Recognition. And it wasn't that he suddenly saw me as family. It wasn't paternal warmth. It wasn't affection. It was clarity. The kind that cuts you open and leaves you breathless. I was not just the poor girl who didn't fit in. I was not just the outsider at the table. I was not even the mistake Lorraine had tried to erase. I was the consequence of silence, of cowardice, of the choices they thought would never come back. The room remained still. The guests didn't speak. Some looked down. Others stared blankly ahead, unsure of what response was appropriate in the face of something so raw. The discomfort hung like fog, and in that stillness, I felt strangely calm. This was not a fairy tale. There would be no sudden embrace, no tears of reunion. But there was power in knowing. There was strength in truth. And now it was mine. Lorraine finally moved, her fingers curling against the tablecloth, her jaw set in concrete lines. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her expression said it all. This was the crack she couldn't patch, the shadow she couldn't hide. She had won every battle by controlling the story. But now the story had turned on her. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply sat with it. The weight of 20 years, rising from the grave, not as vengeance, but as light. It filled the room like dawn, inch by inch, illuminating everything they had tried to keep hidden. I had come into this family a stranger. But now they had to see me for what I was. Not a guest. Not an intruder, but blood and truth. It began not with an exhale, but with the absence of breath. A room full of people, and not one dared to move. The clinking of cutlery, the soft chatter, even the faint background hum of music, All of it collapsed into a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as though the air had been sucked out through some invisible rupture and left behind only weight. No one spoke. No one blinked. The truth had landed like a stone through glass, shattering the veneer of celebration. And what remained now was the stunned quiet of a collective realization. Nothing about this night would return to what it was, meant to be. I sat still in the storm of stillness, letting the silence wrap itself around me like armor. It didn't suffocate. It steadied. After everything, after the whispered insults, the staged smiles, the public degradation, I was finally cradled in the sound of their discomfort. They didn't know where to look anymore. Not at me, not at Lorraine, not at David, who now sat as if he had shrunk inside himself, elbows on the table, hands clenched together so tightly his knuckles blanched white. The man who was supposed to stand beside me for the rest of our lives couldn't even meet my gaze, and Lorraine, she had, turned to stone. Her face, once animated with the joy of control, was now hollow, frozen, the corners of her mouth locked in a twitch that suggested she couldn't quite decide whether to scream or leave the room. Her hands were no longer moving, no longer fidgeting, with her napkin, or fixing the silverware as she so often did when things veered beyond her management. Her posture, usually so poised, had gone rigid. She sat there like a woman witnessing the collapse of a kingdom she had built brick by brick, with lies and curated reputation. The walls she had raised so high had finally failed to keep the past out. I could feel their stares even in their attempt to avoid me. The guests, some familiar, some strangers, all trying to reconstruct the boundaries of their manners in the face of this rupture. No one knew what response etiquette allowed when the groom's mother was exposed for burying a child and branding her son's bride a shame, only to discover the same blood ran in her veins. Their plates sat full and forgotten. Champagne flutes caught the light, but no longer shimmered with celebration. It all felt abandoned now, like the aftermath of a disaster, except the disaster had come not in fire or flood, but in words. The weight of truth is not in its volume, but in its permanence. What had been said could not be unsaid. There was no undoing the confession. And there was no comfort to be found in pretending nothing had changed. I could see it in the way some guests gripped the edges of their chairs, others staring into their laps, caught between a sense of obligation to remain and the primal instinct to flee. Eyes flicked to Lorraine, then to her husband, then to me. I was the axis now, the center of a shift none of them had consented to but could no longer ignore. In this new stillness, I realized that silence could be louder than accusation. That in some rooms, the refusal to speak was its own form of judgment. The very absence of sound condemned her more than outrage ever could. They didn't stand up for me when she humiliated me. They didn't interfere when she called me a shame, but now they wouldn't clap. They wouldn't raise glasses. They wouldn't laugh at her stories. They wouldn't pretend. It wasn't justice. Not fully. But it was something. David finally looked at me. It was a slow, aching motion, his eyes lifting from his hands with all the fragility of a man realizing the foundation he'd relied on was rotten. He looked at me not with apology. He was too stunned for that, but with the searching gaze of someone trying to reconcile who he thought I was with who I had always been. His mouth opened, but no words came, and I didn't help him. I didn't soften. I didn't offer a nod of reassurance or a smile to ease the weight pressing down on his shoulders. I let him sit in it. Because I had sat in silence for too long, I remembered every time I had let myself shrink to fit into a room where I was only barely tolerated. Every time I'd bent my back to avoid conflict, masked my truth in politeness, told myself that love required compromise, even when the cost was myself. But the truth had arrived, and now I knew what it felt like to be undeniable. Lorraine's husband, the man who had once allowed silence to keep him safe, remained standing, for a long while. He didn't return to his seat immediately. He stood like a man who had just placed a match to a dry field and now had to watch it burn. He had no victory in his expression, only consequence. I couldn't read his thoughts. Maybe he mourned the peace he had shattered. Maybe he mourned that it had taken him 20 years to lift his voice. Or maybe, in the quiet of his heart, he felt lighter. He finally sat, slowly, as though the weight of the truth had aged him in seconds. The officiant, forgotten in the background all evening, stood frozen, eyes wide, hands clasped, unsure if the ceremony was still meant to happen. Behind him, the photographer lowered his camera, uncertain of whether the moment unfolding was a tragedy or a milestone. Somewhere in the kitchen, the staff had stopped moving, listening. The entire estate seemed to hold its breath. I scanned the room and saw my mother. She hadn't moved. She hadn't cried. But her chin was tilted slightly higher than before. And in her eyes I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Relief. Not joy, not triumph. Just the quiet release of a weight she had carried alone for far too long. For the first time, she wasn't protecting me. She didn't have to. The truth had done it for her. And then, just when I thought the silence had reached its peak, someone stood. A cousin, maybe. I didn't know her well. She rose slowly, eyes darting between Lorraine and me, and then she stepped away from the table and walked out. No drama, no words. Just her departure. A signal. Others followed. Some excused themselves. Some didn't bother. The exits became streams of silk and wool and polite shoes hurrying toward the comfort of distance. Not all. But enough. This wasn't the wedding they'd come for. And still, I sat, unmoved, rooted. Because I had nowhere else to be but right here, in the silence that no longer belonged to her, the silence that was mine now. And in that silence, I heard something I'd waited my whole life to hear. Respect. We didn't dance. There was no first song, no awkward swaying beneath dimmed lights and forced smiles. The music had stopped hours before, replaced by low voices and the shuffle of departing footsteps. The tables that had been so meticulously arranged were half abandoned, half cleared, ghosted by guests who didn't know how to sit comfortably in the wake of truth. The cake remained untouched, a towering display of fondant and artificial perfection standing cold and irrelevant beneath the hum of overhead lights. The candles burned low, puddles of wax forming slow and silent monuments to a night that had unraveled into something no one could have predicted. David stayed quiet beside me, not because he was being respectful, but because there was nothing he could say. We hadn't spoken since the silence settled over the room like a shroud. He hadn't asked if I was okay. He hadn't offered to explain himself, or even apologize for the way he'd let me stand there alone while his mother dressed me down in front of everyone we knew. The shock had muted him, frozen him into a version of himself I didn't recognize, and maybe he was waiting for me to rescue him from it, to tell him it was still okay to call this a wedding. But I wasn't going to lie for him anymore. Not to him. Not to myself. I didn't know what we were now. Whatever was left between us sat in the space where the bouquet had been placed, a gap at the center of the table filled only with stale air and things unsaid. I looked at him once, just once, and in that glance I saw a man unraveling, slowly, carefully, as though still trying to hold his posture for the benefit of a camera that had long since stopped recording. The guilt hadn't hit him fully yet. Not the way it had hit me, years ago, when I first realized what it meant to love someone who only wanted part of you. I didn't hate him. That would have been easier. I just didn't believe in him anymore. And that was worse. Lorraine had disappeared before the last of the guests had gone. She'd left without ceremony, slipping into the shadows of the hallway with her shoulders drawn high, and her husband trailing behind her, his face hollow, his steps unsure. I didn't know what she would do now. Maybe she'd try to control the story again, reframe it in a version more palatable for the people still willing to listen. Maybe she'd retreat, rebuild, tell herself that she was the victim of a moment gone wrong. Maybe she'd finally be quiet. But I didn't care. Whatever she did, it wouldn't reach me. Not anymore. The truth had already done its damage. It had also done its cleansing. That was the strange thing about exposure. Once the light floods in, there's no going back to darkness, no matter how tightly you shut your eyes. The story she tried to bury had surfaced. It had grown legs, grown a voice, grown a spine. It had sat down at her dinner table and looked her in the eye. And now, it would walk freely in the world, whether she liked it or not. I changed in the small side room near the service corridor. I peeled off the satin dress that no longer felt like mine, maybe it never did, and slipped into the cotton blouse and long black skirt I had brought as an afterthought, just in case. My mother helped me with the buttons, her hands steady, her mouth silent. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Everything had already been said between us, even the things that had never been voiced aloud. Her fingers lingered at my shoulders for a moment longer than necessary, and when I turned to look at her, I saw tears in her eyes. Not the kind that needed comforting, but the kind that came with relief. She had carried this for so long, and now, at last, it wasn't hers alone. We walked outside together, past the last few stragglers who nodded awkwardly as we passed. Some tried to make eye contact, but most looked down, suddenly preoccupied with phones or handbags or the scent of the cool night air. Let them. I wasn't looking for validation. I didn't need apologies from strangers who had watched and said nothing. I had become my own witness. The car was waiting by the curb, its headlights casting long shadows across the gravel. My brother sat in the driver's seat, his face tight with worry, his fingers tapping the wheel. He didn't speak either. Just looked at me through the mirror as I climbed into the back seat, my mother beside me. We didn't drive away immediately. There was no rush now. Everything that had to break had already broken. In the silence of the car, I let the weight of the night settle across my shoulders, not as a burden, not anymore, but as a kind of cloak, earned, honest, heavy in the way that only survival could be. I stared out the window at the estate fading behind us, at the lights glowing like false stars, soft and meaningless against the real ones above. I wondered what they would tell each other in the days to come, how the story would shift and distort in the retelling. But I wasn't afraid of their versions. I had lived mine. I had stood in the room where everything cracked open and still chosen not to disappear. We reached home before dawn. The sky was bruising at the edges, that strange violet gray that only comes just before light. My mother went inside first. My brother carried the bag. I lingered on the porch for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of dust and jasmine, the kind of air that doesn't pretend to be more than it is. I sat down on the steps, barefoot, the gravel cool beneath my soles, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel tired, not defeated, just tired. There would be questions. There would be decisions to make, conversations to have, but not yet. Not in this moment. I didn't need closure. I didn't need revenge. I had something better. I had truth. I had my name. I had the knowledge that nothing they had tried to strip from me, my dignity, my belonging, my worth, had ever really been theirs to take. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to vanish. Sometimes surviving is the story. And I had survived.